all this. Great. So, hi everyone. I am pleased to welcome you to this interview with Professor Samuel D. Kassow, who is the author of Who Will Write Our History, and the Charles Northam Professor of History at Trinity College. He lectures widely on Russian and Jewish history all over the world, and he comes to us today primarily because of his incredibly powerful book, Who Will Write Our History. If you haven't read the book, many of you might have even watched the film, the film that came out about 2 years ago. I guess we screened it last year at our synagogue. And so we are so pleased to have the original author of the book, Professor Kassow, with us now. So thank you so much for being with us, Professor Kassow. We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy Sunday. And I note that today is the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, which, we're filming this or recording this interview this day for our community's Yom HaShoah observance beginning tomorrow evening. But there's something really fitting and appropriate, I think, in the timing of how this has all come to be. So thank you for bringing your knowledge, your insights, and your stories to us this day and forward. So I wondered, by way of beginning, if you wouldn't mind sharing just a little bit about your own background, your own personal story, your own academic background, kind of what led you to eventually write a book about Emanuel Ringelblum and the Oyneg Shabes and its resultant archives.
Okay, well, in terms of my own personal background, I was born in Europe. My parents were Holocaust survivors. I was born after the war. I spent the first few years of my life in a displaced persons camp. I came to the States when I was a toddler, when I was 3 years old. My relatives who did survive the war survived through miracles, very dramatic, incredible, hard to believe stories, which I didn't find out about until much later, really, although I could sense right from the beginning that there was kind of a backdrop that wasn't very nice. I decided to become a historian, but because of the issues connected with the Holocaust, I made a decision that I would not have anything to do with Jewish history or the history of the Holocaust because it was too personal a subject. So I went into Russian history. I spent 2 years in the former Soviet Union in the 1970s. And the first 15 years of my writing was on Russian history. I wrote about the Russian universities, Russian intellectual history. And then when my parents passed away, and my father died in 1987, my mother died in 1994, I began to have an epiphany. That is, I began to understand that the history of the Holocaust, as it was being written in the United States and in Europe, not so much in Israel, but as it was being written in the US and Europe, really focused on the Germans, on the perpetrators. The Jews had no voice, they had no agency, they had no identity. One reason for this was, of course, that the Germans left a lot more documents. Two, that most historians who wrote about the Holocaust couldn't read Jewish languages. And therefore, it didn't matter whether these were great scholars like Raoul Hilberg, who was the pioneer in the United States of serious Holocaust scholarship. The Jews were objects. Things were done to them. And whenever Jews were described or talked about, the descriptions were very inaccurate. And since I grew up speaking Yiddish, and I still write and lecture in Yiddish when people ask me to, and since I can read Hebrew, I understood that there is a whole gold mine of material about the lives of the Jews under the German occupation everywhere, but of course in Poland and in Lithuania, which was my field of special interest, and that I could use this. And by using this, I could tell the story of the Jews, not just in terms of their victimhood, but in terms of their lives, their culture, the story of the ghettos, not just as mere holding pens for the death camps, but as many Jewish communities in their own right, shaped to some degree by pre-war values and pre-war culture. And this is what I set out to do. And the story of Emanuel Ringelblum really brings a lot of themes together. It really is not a Holocaust story per se. It's a story about the culture of Polish Jewry, a community of almost 4 million people, ideologically very diverse. A major trend in pre-war Polish Jewry was Jewish secularism, but this Jewish secularism was still very proudly Jewish. Some of it went in directions of extreme Marxism, others went in the direction of cultural secularism. And the idea of using history as a pillar of secular Jewish identity was something that was very important before the war in Poland, building on the ideas of Dubnow and Schipper and Balavan. Younger historians like Emanuel Ringelblum tried to use the YIVO, the Yiddish Scientific Institute, as an agency that would not only gather documents and encourage the writing of Jewish history, but bring ordinary Jews into the process, collect documents, collect folklore, collect jokes, do etchings on old gravestones, and give Jews a sense of their ownership. They weren't aliens on the Polish lands. They weren't dropped from Mars. They'd lived here for centuries. They had rights. They had ownership. They deserved to be there. So history became not just an abstract object of study, but it became a life-determining tool, and it became kind of a weapon to defend Jewish rights. And this was something that was carried over into the Holocaust.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting when you share your own story and then having read about Emanuel Ringelblum specifically through your book, you know, you see so many parallels, as you just said, and the stories do come together quite beautifully. You know, the idea of this rich Jewish history, in particular, beyond just like the Sabbath Jew, as is mentioned in your writing. You know, that there was the secular Jew who deserved a seat at the table, who was a picture of real Jewish living, in particular Polish Jewish living, which had not gotten, I guess, the screen time or the air time, to sort of misappropriate the phrase, as like sort of a more German Jewish reality or other Jewish populations that had gotten maybe a little more attention or had been understood as the mainstream and this reservoir of richness in the Polish Jewish community.
Yes, and not just the secular Jew, but the idea that Jewish history had to not just be a history of ideas, not just a history of Jewish religion, not just a history of Jewish intellect, as German Jewish historians like Heinrich Gretz wanted to write it, but it had to be a history of the entire people. And that meant the forgotten people, women, beggars, the artisans, the marginal elements of Jewish society. This was a very novel approach to Jewish history. It was something which demanded a new kind of documentation. It demanded a lot of interviewing, a lot of oral history. It demanded a lot of outreach. It was interdisciplinary. And there's something else. which is that the YIVO, which kind of produced this approach, and Ringelblum, of course, was very active in the pre-war YIVO, and the Oyneg Shabes archive was basically a continuation of the YIVO in the Warsaw Ghetto. The YIVO, in turn, drew some of its inspiration from, believe it or not, African-American universities and colleges in the United States, because the director of the YIVO, Max Weinreich, got a Rockefeller Fellowship to spend a year at Yale in the early 30s. And he was kind of racking his brains of how to buck up the morale of Polish Jewish young people who were basically told by the surrounding Polish society they were less. They had no future. They would not get jobs. It would be nice if they left Poland, but don't count on any future in this country. They were told they were inferior. And Weinreich wanted to find some way to give Jewish young people some ways of protecting themselves psychologically. And so when he was at Yale, he decided to go to Tuskegee. He went to Morehouse. He went to the South. He investigated how do African Americans in a Jim Crow society, how do they give their young people a sense of self-respect, psychological armor, when they're surrounded by people who say that they're nothing? And so he began to pioneer this idea of learning about the lives of Jews, especially young Jews, as individuals, encouraging them to write their life stories, encouraging them to write about their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations. And this method of interviewing and reaching out became a major tool of the Oyneg Shabes archive in the Warsaw Ghetto.
That's fascinating. I've never heard that. What an incredible... there's so much learning that could be understood and taken from that. That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. So tell us then a little bit about Emanuel Ringelblum and the kind of approach he brought from pre-war, his learnings into, and his approach to history, and then how he brought that in to the creation and continuation of the Oyneg Shabes, and ultimately in the hopes of the production of its archive and what it would then, they hoped, result in one day. And I wonder if you could also speak a little to Emanuel Ringelblum's kind of personality, his optimism, for lack of a better word, that kind of continues even through, I'm always struck by his writings after the BBC broadcast, even up till then, his kind of hopes for what could be, and that kind of hopeful attitude that he brought throughout, or mostly throughout.
Okay, well, keep in mind that Emanuel Ringelblum in some ways was a product of his time. That is, he was born in 1900 in Buchach, the same town where Shai Agnon lived, the Nobel laureate, and he was a cousin of Shai Agnon. Sigmund Freud's grandfather came from that town. Many other great Jews came from there. But in a way, he was born at the wrong time, because by the time he turned 14, that world began to collapse. World War I devastated the town. His family was forced to flee in the face of the Cossacks, the Russian army. The town was burned down. And when he matured, when he grew into adulthood, it was a very different world. And he was born into the Habsburg Empire, which was, very open and tolerant, especially of Jews. But by the time he was 17, this had been replaced by a new Polish state, which was very ethno-nationalistic, where Jews were told in no uncertain terms that, it's better if you peoples just get out of here. And so Jewish young people had to kind of dig into themselves and find some source of hope and inspiration. The week he turned 17, two things happened which kind of changed things. One was the Balfour Declaration, which promised salvation through Zionism. The other was the Bolshevik Revolution, which promised salvation through communism. And Ringelblum, like a lot of other young people, grabbed onto both. That is, he grabbed onto Zionism, but he also grabbed onto a belief in Soviet Marxism, and he became a member of the Left Labor Zionists, which was a group in interwar Poland that was Zionist, but that was very Marxist and that was very Yiddishist. So what Ringelblum got from that was this incredible sense of dedication to the working class, to ordinary poor Jews, and to Yiddish culture. And that was kind of overlaid with a pro-Soviet orientation. And then, of course, Ringelblum had to make a living. So he had to do 4 or 5 different jobs. He got a PhD in history in 1926 from Warsaw University. But of course, there was no hope of getting a regular academic job. But even though he only had an hour a day to work in the archives, he still wrote about 4 books. And as a historian, he saw himself as a soldier. That is, Polish historians were using history to show that Jews were aliens and they had weakened Poland. So not just Ringelblum, but other Jewish historians had to publish their books to show that Jews had built up the country. They had been there for years. They had as much right to the country as the Poles did. The third thing Ringelblum did was he became a community organizer. And in the late 1930s, he started to work for the Joint Distribution Committee and started organizing microcredit loan societies, which was an idea long before its time. A guy who organized microcredit in Bangladesh got the Nobel Prize for that. And the idea of microcredit was not just to give you $10 to tide you over, but it was the moral aspect, that you weren't alone, that you had somewhere to turn to, that somebody cared about you. And the politics, the community organizing, and the history all came together. That is, Ringelblum's idea of being a Jewish historian was not just academic, but it was focused on the community. And not only that, but a historian was not just somebody who wrote history. A historian was somebody who reached out to graduate students, who reached out to up-and-coming high school teachers, who encouraged ordinary people to do history. So publishing bibliographies, organizing seminars, organizing Sunday teach-ins was just as important as writing books. And it was because Ringelblum had that view of what a historian should do that he organized the archive. If he'd been a quote-unquote famous historian like Schipper or Balaban, it never would have occurred to him. And there's another thing I want to say here, which is that crises like war sometimes teach us that people that we thought were great turn out to be not so great. And people that were overlooked or kind of passed over as nice, routine, journeyman types rise to greatness. And Ringelblum was one of those people who rose to greatness because of the war. Before the war, he was not regarded as being part of the major leagues. He was AAA. He was an earnest, hardworking, journeyman historian, working 4 jobs, teaching in different high schools, spending his spare time teaching evening classes to working class kids, very idealistic. A father, he found his true love within the party. They had one child, Uri, who was the apple of his eye. He was a very sincere person. By our standards, he was super PC. He was very politically correct.
Yeah, you know, and how you describe him really throughout the book. I mean, you spend so much of your book talking about so much about the other members of the Oyneg Shabes and all of the other content and artists and goals and everything else that it talks about. But in your description of Ringelblum, you really get this deep sense of his humanity, his humility, but also his drive, this incessant drive and his, what appears to be the way he was able to motivate others to rise, and elevate in purpose, if not in notoriety. I'm struck by the fact that, I don't know if until your book came out, anyone would have known the name Emanuel Ringelblum, and I'll come back to that in a two more questions about why do you think that is, and telling us a little bit about how it is that once these archives were discovered, how they were dispersed, and your own process of research in the book. But along those lines about others who were elevated, could you tell us a little bit about how members of the Oyneg Shabes were recruited or came to join in, and the directives they were given? And you can't tell us about all of them, but I know for me, for example, one of the people I learned about because of you is Rachel Auerbach, who has become kind of like a hero for me, and in a way that I never anticipated that. And for me, it was pretty transformative learning about her through your writing. I wonder if for you, you might share just 1, 2, 3 other people that you think our folks should know. Obviously, there's so many, and hopefully they'll read, but a couple maybe.
Yeah, I'm actually translating Rachel Auerbach's memoirs into English, and I helped to organize a conference on her at Yale in November, which was very successful. So hopefully we'll be hearing more about her.
Oh, I can't wait.
But Ringelblum brought together about 60 people, all in all.
Yeah.
The famous, the not so famous, young and old. They're people like Rabbi Shimon Huberbaum, communists like Yehuda Feld, Zionist Bundes. And these people have their differences. They came from different backgrounds, but they have this common mission to document Jewish life during the war. Of the 60 people, there were only 3 survivors. And of the 3 survivors, Rachel Auerbach, Hirschwasser, and his wife, only one, Hirschwasser, knew where the archive had been buried. So finding the archive, that was a close call. But when I think of the people in the Oyneg Shabes, I mean, there were so many remarkable people. Rachel Auerbach, who survived and became one of the main figures in Yad Vashem at a time when not just non-Jewish historians, but even many Jewish scholars were poo-pooing survivor testimony and saying that it was not a reliable source. Rachel Auerbach spoke up for the value of listening to the voice of the victims, even if it was not accurate in every single date and jot of memory. And she was one of the people that were responsible for the fact that the Eichmann trial, unlike the Nuremberg trials, was a trial based largely on survivor testimony rather than on documents. So she was a remarkable person. There was Rabbi Shimon Huberbaum, an Orthodox rabbi who lost his wife and child as soon as the Germans invaded Poland. They were killed by a German bomb. And he went into the Warsaw Ghetto and became one of the key helpers of Emanuel Ringelblum, interviewing people, serving as a conduit to the religious circles in the Warsaw Ghetto. We read so much today about the Piaseczner Rebbe, Rabbi Kalana Shapiro, who is one of the great thinkers of Jewish orthodoxy and whose sermons in the Warsaw Ghetto were incredible. Very few people know that it was only because of Shimon Huberbaum and Menachem Cohen who got his writings deposited in the archive, that those writings survived at all. There's Abraham Levin, who kept a diary in Yiddish, a remarkable document. And when he came home to find that his wife had been taken to Treblinka, he shifted the language from Yiddish to Hebrew and turned it into a Pinkas, kind of a traditional chronicle Jewish suffering. There's Henrika Lazavertovna, who, a young woman, a poet, who wrote a poem dedicated to the Jewish child who would smuggle food into the ghetto. There's Leib Golden, who wrote this incredible essay about hunger. I mean, there are just, each of these people had a remarkable story.
Yeah, I just, for me, you know, you have written, I'd be interested to know how you understand your book. You know, your book is a history book, as it were. For me, as a rabbi and a person who I would categorize myself as a spiritual person, you know, it resonates with me spiritually most deeply too, and kind of crosses all of those different lines, in particular in how you're able to tell us of the lives of these people. And in doing so, I think fulfill, you know, you speak a lot in the book about how Ringelblum and others understood kind of the dual functioning of their work. On the one hand, they were part of this national effort, national mission, that the Jewish people be the ones telling their own story, and that they collectively might be remembered, but then also that these individuals would be remembered. There are these, in your introduction, I just want to read it for the people who haven't read your book yet, and you speak, your book opens with the discovery of the archives. So we sort of begin, once the story is almost over, you know, we start towards the end. But you talk about Israel Lichtenstein and how he had rushed to hide the archives. And he and Vassar, you tell their stories and you say, Israel Lichtenstein's testament recorded pride in a job well done. He was sure he had hidden the archive well. Only Wasser would know where to find it. And then Lichtenstein writes, you quote, I do not ask for any thanks, for any memorial, for any praise. I wish only to be remembered. And Lichtenstein's thoughts then turn to his wife. I mean, this part is also haunting, and his beloved daughter, Margalit. And he writes, I wish my wife to be remembered. I don't know if I'll pronounce her name the right way. Gele, how do you pronounce her name?
Gele.
Thank you. Gele Sextine, am I pronouncing it right? Okay, I just want to make sure. Gele Sextine. She has worked during the war years with children as an educator and teacher. I wish my little daughter to be remembered. Margalit is 20 months old today. She has fully mastered the Yiddish language and speaks it perfectly. The naming, you know, just the naming of the names, and that the names should be remembered, to me is just incredibly powerful, in that all of these names were held contained in these archives that, thank God, were found, but you have brought to us in a way that we can access them and know their names. So I thank you for telling us about some of them, and I hope that whoever's watching this, if they haven't read your book, will read it to learn more, because there are just so many, all the different categories, the secretaries, protectors, activists, teachers, economists, writers, journalists, comrades, survivors. You break them down into a number of categories in your book, but it's so powerful. So one other just question about the archives in and of themselves and Ringelblum's approach. You quote having said, nothing is unimportant. And how that understanding of recording anything and everything in real time really guided his approach. I wonder if you could expand on that a little more. You hinted at that in terms of the methodology he learned early on, and then how he applied that in the Warsaw Ghetto and what that really meant in terms of what was being recorded.
Yeah, well, as a trained historian, Ringelblum instinctively understood the difference between contemporaneous real-time testimony by people who were still alive, who were still in a ghetto that had not yet been destroyed, people who had not yet been murdered. The difference between that kind of testimony and the future testimony of survivors. That is, a survivor would look back after the war and, you know, living in Evanston, Illinois, or living in Israel, and if their grandchildren say, Bubby or Zadie, what happened to you, or if they testify to Spielberg or to the Fortunoff archive at Yale, they knew what happened. They knew that eventually the Germans try to murder everybody. And so their stories would have focused on how they survived. The ghetto, which was a real community, would have shrunk to the proportions of a tiny little antechamber to the death camps. They would have totally forgotten what they were thinking, hoping for in the ghettos. But what the archive was doing is that by getting testimony in real time and by telling people, it's not for you to decide that this is important and this is not important. Write everything down because you don't know what posterity is going to think is important. This is going to give people a real sense of who we were before we were killed. And that approach was very effective because it enabled us to understand who these people really were, the voices of Polish Jewry before it was destroyed, the children writing essays in the schools in June 1942, what do I want to do when the war is over? A woman running her house committee, calling together Mrs. Shapiro, Mrs. Kaplan, trying to put together a roster of poor kids in the building and matching them with families who might feed them once a day. A ghetto mailman describing children on a bench crying for their parents and Jews not being allowed to give them water or food. These little vignettes of everyday life. Then, of course, there was the fact that beginning in 1941, the archive embarked on what was to be a 1,600-page study of Jewish society during the war. 80 different topics: women, children, corruption. When they began, nobody knew the Germans were going to kill everybody. And so kind of as they were collecting material, the context changed. By 1942, they understood that the issue was not getting information for the post-war, but the issue was leaving a trace after they were killed. And yet the material they collected was incredible. Now, let me give you one example. One of the topics was Jewish women during the war. And when the study was begun, nobody thought the Germans were going to kill everybody. The woman who was charged with running this study was a woman called Cecilia Slepak. And she interviewed women, and she was, you know, eager, and she was very diligent. And by May 1942, she had gotten to the point where she could write her introductory essay, which survived. She and her daughter were killed in Treblinka. But the essay said, we have learned that the war has shown that Jewish women are much more psychologically resilient than men. They're less prone to depression. As the war goes on, more and more of the burden of keeping the ghetto going rests on women's shoulders. And let me say this, I am sure that when this war is over, the Jewish woman in Poland will not let herself be pushed back into the kitchen. She will demand a seat at the table. Now, let's assume she'd survived the war. She probably would have forgotten that there was a time when she was thinking about Jewish women getting a seat at the table. She would have focused on how she survived. And so this is an example of very valuable insights that otherwise we would have totally lost.
Yeah, and I think like that idea of like the closest truth in the moment, or the difference between the telling of history versus how it's remembered, history versus memory. You know, any recollection, the minute it's after, there's no way that it can be a total, you know, accurate telling. Obviously, memory comes into play, but I so appreciated and also was haunted by many of these tidbits from the archives, you know, which showed glorious, amazing, wonderful things and just horrible things. And the idea that there was no editorial hand kind of washing it over. And I think that that really distinguished, from what I understand, the Warsaw Ghetto archives from, say, like the Loge archives, where there was some kind of elder, somebody looked at it and kind of pass it over, as I understand, or maybe tried to make it a little more, I don't know what the word is because I don't want to disparage anybody, but try to make it a little more brandable, a little more palatable. And the Warsaw Ghetto, the Oyneg Shabes work is just heart-wrenching. You know, there's that one, it's just still with me, a telling of a mother who has a dead child and is starving herself and consumes the remains of her child. And I mean, I remember reading that in your book years ago. It still stays with me as a haunting. And at the same time, I think this is how we come to understand the truth of the experience, and to somehow gloss it over, try to romanticize it in some way, is to deny the agency and the truth of these people's lives and experiences.
Yeah. A major difference between Jewish writing in the war and Jewish writing after the war is that Jewish writing in the war, and this is true of Warsaw, Lodz, Vilna, there's incredible anger against other Jews, which really comes out, because the average Jew didn't see a lot of Germans. They saw other Jews. They saw Jewish police. They saw Jewish bosses. They saw Jewish foremen. They saw the Judenrat. And after the war, of course, the 6 million became 6 million martyrs, Kedoshim. And you couldn't say bad things about the dead. But Ringelblum knew that he had to, as far as possible, provide a truthful account. Yeah. And that meant leaving in a lot of stuff that didn't paint Jews in a good light. Yeah. But he knew this was necessary. Here's an example. One member of the archive, Shia Perla, on August 25th, at the height of the roundups, saw the following scene. A Jewish policeman is dragging a little 5-year-old Jewish kid to his SS handler, saying, "Here's my 5th head of the day." The Jewish police had to catch 5 Jews a day, thinking they were going to save their own skins, and it would be checked off. And some Jewish policemen would catch 12 and then auction off the surplus to others for diamonds, gold, jewels. The corruption was terrible. The German pulled out his pistol, shot the little boy, and told the Jewish policeman to run and catch an adult, because, quote, "this little dog doesn't count as a head." And the Jewish policeman scampered off to catch another Jew. And Perla was so shaken that he wrote in his diary on August 25th, 1942, he said, "A people that can produce such scum, such filth as the Jewish police is perhaps a people that deserves everything it's getting." Now, can you imagine? He never would have said that after the war in a DP camp at a memorial service to say, well, we produce Jewish police, therefore we deserve what we got. No way. Now, Perla was killed in Auschwitz in 1943, but that was found in the milk can. That means Ringelblum read it. Why did he put it in the milk can? Because not only did he want future historians to trust him and trust his objectivity. He did not live to see the era of alternative facts. He still believed in real facts, right?
Right.
But there was something else. Ringelblum believed that when future historians studied those documents, they would see, he compared it to a kettle of boiling water. The top is kind of sizzling and there are a lot of bubbles, and the top layer is the corruption, is the demoralization, right, is the betrayal, but then the bottom layer, he believed, was the real story, and that was the story of hundreds of thousands of ordinary Jews who did the best they could. What Ringelblum called it, he said it in Yiddish, das stille Heldentum von dem jüdischen Massenmensch, the quiet heroism of the ordinary Jew. Ordinary Jews who didn't have money, didn't have connections, and who did what they could to keep their human dignity, help themselves, help each other, help their friends, and they were just swept away. No one survived from those groups, and he believed that by bringing in this kind of negative stuff, which was true, he would also encourage future historians to look past the negative and understand the positive on its own terms.
Yeah, thank you. So I wonder if you, can then kind of come forward a bit and tell us, just to catch everybody up, there were 3, as I understand it, caches in the archive. 2 of the 3 were discovered. And then 1 remains, no one knows where it is. And I think the general understanding is it's likely not to be found unless by some random accident. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, there were, the first cache was buried on August 3rd, 1942. The deportations to Treblinka began on July 22nd. 4 days later, Ringelblum called an emergency meeting. Everybody was told, hand in your notes, your unfinished notes, just hand it in. And that was buried by Israel Lichtenstein, these 2 teenage kids, on August 3rd. That was buried in aluminum boxes. So that was found on September 18th, 1946. And a lot of water had seeped in, a lot of the stuff was ruined, but that was that. That's what it was. And then 4 years later, Polish construction workers came across 2 aluminum milk cans. That was the second cache, buried in February 1943. Those construction workers were going to just toss it because they thought it would be gold, diamonds. The Jews had left all these riches. And when they saw it was just documents, they were going to toss it. But the foreman came back from his lunch break and said, no, we have to take the— and
do something with this.
And this is all the diaries, Ringelblum's diary, Lewin's diary, Heuerbach's diary. Then there was a third cache, according to Hirschwasser, a week before the outbreak of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, in April 1943. They buried a third cache under the brushmaker's shop. And that was Świętojarskie 34. There was heavy fighting in the uprising. That place was also picked clean by Polish scavengers looking for Jewish gold. Over time, that became the site of the Chinese embassy in Poland. About 10 or 15 years ago, Israeli searchers got permission from the Chinese to look underneath the embassy. They couldn't find anything. Now, there's a guy, Richard Freund, who has this super duper technological stuff, and he's trying to get the Chinese to let him in once again. Who knows what's going to happen? My guess is that Polish scavengers found the stuff and they just tossed it. So I don't think it'll ever be found. So a lot of stuff has been lost, but yet the whole archive has just been published in book form in Warsaw, and it comes to 36 volumes.
Right.
So just imagine how much more there would have been.
Would have been, yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about your research process? As I understand it, the contents of the archives that were found were sort of dispersed around to different countries. So it's one of those questions about, well, how come we didn't hear about Ringelblum earlier? How come we didn't know these stories earlier? So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit just about your own research, where you had to go, what you had to do in order to gather and compile one narrative.
It was incredibly difficult. It was really tough because the key was finding a hook. The key was finding a way of organizing this. You couldn't write a biography of Ringelblum. There wasn't really enough material.
Right.
You didn't want to write another history of the Warsaw Ghetto. How do you write about the archive? And that took me a few years. And the whole project took about eight years altogether. When you write about an archive, by definition, an archive that was interrupted by murder was an archive that was not organized. It was just a lot of stuff shoved into boxes and milk cans. And what do you do with that? And a lot of the documents were illegible. A lot were semi-legible. Some documents were in good shape. Most were not. The originals were all in Warsaw at the Jewish Historical Institute.
Okay.
But Ringelblum tried to make copies of each document. So he didn't have Xerox machines. He didn't have an iPhone, but he had people trying to make handwritten or typed copies. So in the 1950s, the Jewish Historical Institute let Yad Vashem make a microfilm. But what they microfilmed were not the most legible copies. So in a given document, you might have a mishmash of legible and illegible pages. And then in 1990, the US Memorial Holocaust Museum made a microfilm. But it meant that if you, say, wanted to look at a certain document, like that report on women, which was, say, 50 pages long, you had to go to Warsaw, Israel, and Washington, because the Washington might have pages that were legible that were not legible in what was shown in Israel. So you had to go from continent to continent. And so it was quite a project, but eventually it all came together. But it was not easy.
No, I cannot even imagine how difficult it was. I'm glad you had the koach, the desire to see it through. It sounds like the kind of thing that any number of people would have said, this might be interesting, but it's just too much of a pain to do.
You got to read a lot of handwriting. 50% of the documents are in Polish, 42% are in Yiddish, 8% were in other languages. So
it's unbelievable. Well, on behalf of anyone who's read your book, and I'm not sure how many editions have been published now. I know it's been translated into any number of languages and is printed, or eight languages around the world. And of course, a film has been made out of it now. You know, its reach is exponentially greater as time goes on. And that's a gift. So we're grateful to you for sticking it out and doing that work. So just one, final question, I guess, as you reflect on where this is now and kind of what you've been able to bring forward, not just into the Jewish world, but into the world. What do you think are the most important takeaways for us, for me, for my generation, for my children's generation, people growing up in a world where often a lot of these genocides are often blurred together into one category, and maybe there's universal human value in that. At the same time, I'm not sure how you feel about it, but it seems that each genocide has its own particular story and lessons to know, learn, take away. I wonder how you see what you've done contributing to lessons that we can learn or should learn.
To understand the idea of resistance. Resistance is not just firing guns. You can fight with pen and paper. The Germans thought they were going to not only murder the Jews, but decide whether they would be remembered, and if so, how they would be remembered. And as one of Ringelblum's teachers said just before he was killed in Majdanek, what we know about murdered peoples is usually what their killers choose to say about them. And so the Jews saw that even if they didn't live to see the end of the war, they would bury time capsules. They would try to fight to make sure they'd be remembered on the basis of Jewish documents. And that was really important. This was resistance, just as fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto was resistance. This is cultural resistance, and it was successful because thanks to this archive, we can write about the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto, not just as victims, but as real individuals and as members of a community. Second, I think one of the things this shows is that it's not an either or. It's not just that we remember this as a Jewish disaster or we remember this as a human disaster. It's not just the Jewish Holocaust or universal genocide. There are elements of both. Ringelblum, being a Marxist, being a socialist, said that he saw this not just as a Jewish disaster, but as a universal tragedy, that there were lessons not just for the Jews, but for the entire human race. That said, since I'm a historian, and since I'm a child of survivors, I would be lying if I didn't say that we should be careful not to go to the extreme of simply saying this is part of a whole series of genocides and forgetting that this is something that happened to the Jewish people, that these people were killed because they were Jews. Historians are looking for what's different about events. We're not looking to build models. We're not looking to build universal templates. We're looking to investigate what made events different in such a way that we're not saying that Jewish children suffered more than Armenian children or Ukrainian children or children in Rwanda, but we're simply saying that what happened to us in the war was different from these tragedies, and it had to be understood on its own terms. And I think there's another takeaway, and this gets to the issue of why Ringelblum was not remembered. I mean, there was lip service, there were Ringelblum streets in Israel, but most of the time people didn't think much about it. And one reason is that after the Holocaust was over, Jews in Israel and in the United States didn't really want to confront what happened. What they wanted to do instead was receive a takeaway for Israelis building a new state against terrible odds. It was a takeaway of Jewish valor and Jewish heroism. It was a way of kind of trying to fudge over the alleged shameful passivity of the 6 million Jews who were killed. So Israelis fastened on the Warsaw Ghetto uprising is something that saved Jewish honor. And the archive is mostly about real Jewish life and not about resistance. American Jews also wanted that takeaway either of martyrdom, Ani Ma'amin, going to the gas chamber, singing these religious songs, or this takeaway of heroism. And again, Ringelblum didn't fit the bill. He was a Marxist, he was pro-Soviet, he wrote very nice things about the Soviet Union. This was better not talked about during the McCarthy era. Mordechai Anilevich, the Jewish commander of the Warsaw Ghetto fighters, said great things about Stalin. Better not to tell the Gentiles about this. So it was convenient not to dig too deeply. But now that time has passed, we have to, look back onto what we lost. And what we lost in the Holocaust is something that we've not yet gotten back. It's not just, okay, the Holocaust happened, we lost 6 million people, but thank God we have a state of Israel and it's all good now. The cultural, spiritual, national energy that was there in East European Jewry is something that we never quite made good. And therefore, I think not just that we should remember, but we should really think about what we lost.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much for that reflection and the lessons and the space for us to live and move forward, which is compelling and necessary, and necessary still, I imagine, will continue to be, certainly for my lifetime. So I just want to thank you. Thank you for your time, Professor Kassow. I really appreciate you taking this time. And I know our community is going to be so grateful to learn from you on Yom HaShoah and afterwards. And we hope that once this COVID-19 pandemic is past and we have freedom of movement again all around, that we hope you will be able to join us maybe at some point when you're visiting. Maybe you'll be able to come visit your cousin, our congregant, Dr. Dina Leonard. And we would love to welcome you into our congregation. Just want to thank Dina for introducing me to you. I'm so grateful. Thank you again. We wish you well, safety, blessing.
Okay, bye-bye.
All of that. Thanks.